The howling wind battered my shutters, threatening to tear them from their hinges. I peered through a crack in the wood, watching as the storm turned our quiet town into a swirling chaos of leaves and debris. By morning, the roads were flooded, trees uprooted, and the bridge, the only way in or out, had collapsed into the raging river. "We're cut off," Sheriff Mills announced at the town hall meeting, his voice strained. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Isolation wasn't new to us, but something about this felt different, heavier. That night the darkness seemed thicker. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a faint whisper carried by the wind. It sounded like my name. I brushed it off as my imagination, but sleep wouldn't come. The next day, Mrs. Thompson didn't open her bakery. Concerned, a few of us went to check on her. Her door was ajar, the inside undisturbed, but she was nowhere to be found. No signs of a struggle, just gone. By the third disappearance, panic set in. People whispered about the woods, how they seemed to encroach closer each day, branches reaching out like twisted fingers. Some claimed to see figures between the trees at dusk, shadows that didn't belong. Determined to find answers, I joined a small group to search the forest's edge. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and an eerie silence swallowed our footsteps. We found nothing but an unsettling stillness that gnawed at our nerves. That evening, I sat on my porch, the weight of exhaustion heavy on my shoulders. That's when I saw him, my neighbor Paul, walking toward the forest in a trance-like state. "Paul!" I shouted, but he didn't turn. I sprinted after him, grabbing his arm just as he reached the tree line. His eyes were vacant, unseeing. Before I could react, a cold wind whipped through the trees, and a chorus of whispers filled my head. Images flashed behind my eyes. Our town expanding, forests cut down, nature pushed aside. A voice, ancient and weary, echoed in my mind. "You have taken, now we reclaim." I stumbled back, releasing Paul. He vanished into the shadows, and the whispers ceased. Breathless, I realized the forest was fighting back, reclaiming what we had neglected. The following days were chaos. More residents disappeared, drawn into the woods by an unseen force. Communication with the outside world was impossible. We were alone. In a desperate attempt, I gathered the remaining townspeople. "We've disrespected the land," I said. "We need to make amends." Skepticism met my plea, but with no alternatives, they agreed. We ventured into the forest, bringing offerings, tokens of respect and promises to change. As we stood among the towering trees, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. One by one, the missing residents emerged from the shadows, confused but unharmed. Relief washed over us, but the lesson was clear. Back in town, we began rebuilding not just our homes, but our relationship with the land. We replanted trees, reduced our footprint, and listened to the whispers, not of malice, but of balance. The bridge was eventually repaired, reconnecting us to the world. But we were different now, humbled guardians of the place we called home. And every so often, when the wind blows just right, I still hear the forest's whisper, a gentle reminder of the harmony we nearly lost. The dense canopy above filtered the sunlight into a mosaic of green and gold. But today the forest felt different, unsettling. I tightened my grip on the camera, ears attuned to the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. As a wildlife researcher, solitude in the woods was my norm, but the uneasy feeling gnawing at me was new. 2 weeks ago, reports of unusual animal behavior drew me to this remote forest. Birds migrating off-season, deer gathering in unnatural numbers, all anomalies I couldn't ignore. Yesterday I found strange symbols carved into tree trunks, resembling ancient runes intertwined with vines. As I ventured deeper, the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, an odd, sweet aroma that made my head swim. Suddenly the underbrush rustled. I froze, raising my camera. Through the lens, I glimpsed figures draped in cloaks of woven leaves, faces obscured by wooden masks carved to resemble twisted human-plant hybrids. My heart pounded. A secretive group in the middle of nowhere? Curiosity overrode caution. I followed them at a distance, careful to stay hidden. They gathered in a clearing where the trees formed a natural circle. At the center stood a massive oak, its bark etched with the same symbols I'd seen. They began to chant, a low hum that resonated with the forest itself. The ground beneath me vibrated. I watched in disbelief as the leader raised his arms, and the tree seemed to respond, its branches stretching unnaturally. A twig snapped under my foot. The chanting stopped. Dozens of masked faces turned toward me. Panic surged. I bolted, weaving through the trees, the sounds of pursuit close behind. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. I stumbled upon a fallen log and went sprawling. Before I could rise, they were upon me. Strong hands pulled me up, and the leader stepped forward, removing his mask. His eyes were a startling shade of green, almost luminescent. "You've seen too much," he said softly. "But perhaps it's not too late." "Who are you?" I demanded, struggling against their grip. "We are the keepers of the Green Man, guardians of the ancient pact between man and nature. The balance has been disturbed, and we seek to restore it." "By doing what?" I asked. "By awakening the Green Man, the spirit of the forest." A chilling realization struck me. "The anomalies, the animal behavior is because of you." He nodded. "Preparations for the awakening. You're meddling with forces you don't understand." "On the contrary," he replied, "it's you outsiders who have lost touch." They bound my hands and led me back to the clearing. The ritual resumed, more intense than before. The ground cracked open near the oak, and a figure began to emerge, a being woven from roots and branches, eyes glowing with ancient wisdom and wrath. Desperation took over. I reached into my pocket for the flare gun, standard issue for emergencies. With hands tied, aiming was futile, but I fired it into the canopy above. The sudden burst of light startled the cultists, and for a moment disrupted the ritual. The ground stopped shaking. The Green Man halted his ascent, turning his gaze upon me. In that instant, I felt an overwhelming connection, a flood of images showing the damage humanity had inflicted upon the natural world. "I'm sorry," I whispered, unsure if he could hear. He stared for a long moment before slowly receding back into the earth. The cultist stood in stunned silence. Seizing the opportunity, I broke into a run, not stopping until I reached my vehicle at the forest's edge. Back in the safety of my office, I reviewed the footage. It was all there, proof of the cult, the ritual, even a glimpse of the Green Man. But as I hovered over the delete button, I hesitated. Exposing them could stop their actions, but perhaps the world needed their warning. With a heavy heart, I deleted the files. Some secrets, I realized, are better left in the shadows of the forest. The roar of chainsaws filled the air, drowning out the whispers of the ancient forest. I tightened my grip on the handle, the vibration numbing my hands as yet another colossal tree began to topple. This was my third week with Timberco, and each day the unease in my gut grew stronger. "Hey, rookie!" Jack hollered over the cacophony. "Keep up, or you'll be left behind." I forced a grin and nodded, but as I glanced up, the canopy seemed to close in, shadows twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The elders in my tribe spoke of forests like this, places where spirits dwelled, not to be disturbed. I shook off the thought. Superstitions had no place here. By midday, we had carved a deep scar into the woodland. The sun struggled to penetrate the lingering mist, casting everything in a grey hue. During our break, Sarah lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. "This place gives me the creeps," she admitted. Before I could respond, a distant howl echoed. The crew fell silent. "Wolves?" someone suggested. But we all knew wolves hadn't roamed these parts for decades. That night I couldn't sleep. The forest was eerily quiet. the usual chorus of insects and nocturnal creatures absent. Lying in my tent, I heard faint murmurs, like distant voices carried on the wind. I stepped outside to investigate. A figure stood at the edge of our camp, a woman draped in vines and leaves, eyes glowing like embers. I blinked, and she was gone. My heart pounded. Had I imagined it? The next morning, Paul's tent was empty. His gear was untouched, but there was no sign of him. Probably wandered off to relieve himself and got lost, Jack scoffed. But as the day wore on, more strange occurrences unsettled us. Equipment malfunctioned without reason. Trees we'd marked for cutting were unmarked. Their scars vanished. The forest seemed to be healing itself. By evening, tension had fractured the crew's bravado. Around the campfire, whispers spread about curses and vengeful spirits. I shared my sighting hesitantly. I think we've disturbed something ancient. Jack slammed his fist on the log. Enough with the ghost stories. We're here to work. That night, a storm rolled in without warning. Fierce winds whipped through the camp, tearing tents apart. Thunder rumbled, but there was no lightning. Only darkness pierced by the glow of those same fiery eyes I'd seen before. Panicked, we huddled together. The woman emerged from the shadows, ethereal and imposing. "You have violated sacred ground," she intoned, her voice echoing like the rustle of leaves. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, trembling. "I am the guardian of this realm, the spirit of the wild you've wounded." "We didn't know," I pleaded. "We're just doing our jobs." "Ignorance does not absolve you," she replied coldly. Vines snaked around our ankles, roots bursting from the soil to ensnare us. One by one, my crew members were pulled into the darkness, their screams swallowed by the forest. Desperate, I remembered a prayer my grandmother taught me, an old plea for forgiveness. I recited it aloud, tears streaming down my face. The grip of the vines loosened. The spirit regarded me silently. "You honor the old ways," she said softly. "Why do you partake in this desecration?" I needed the work, I admitted, but I see now the harm we've caused. She extended a hand. "Will you make amends?" "Yes," I vowed, "whatever it takes." The storm ceased as abruptly as it began. Dawn broke, revealing an untouched forest. No felled trees, no trace of our camp or my crew. I stood alone, the weight of my promise heavy but clear. I returned to civilization and resigned from Timber Co., dedicating myself to conservation efforts. I shared my story, though few believed me. But I didn't care. I knew the truth. Even now, when I wander through lesser woods, I feel the pulse of the wild beneath my feet. The spirit granted me mercy, and I won't waste the second chance. The forest lives, and it remembers, and as its guardian warned, it will no longer suffer our trespasses without consequence.